He was the loudest man in sports, the fastest talker who ever laced up a glove. When Muhammad Ali entered a room, the words came like jabs, quick, rhythmic, impossible to block. He rhymed before rapping had a name. He predicted the round his opponents would fall. He told the entire world he was the greatest. And then he made you believe it. His mouth was a weapon as sharp as his fists. So imagine the cruelty of what came later. The one thing that made him famous, that unstoppable, dazzling voice, slowly, quietly began to disappear. And here is the part almost no one knew at the time. A scientific study of his speech, reported years later, found that the rate at which Ali spoke, his syllables per second, slowed by 26% between the ages of 26 and 39. 26%. That means the decline was already underway while he was still fighting, while the world still roared his name, while he was still, on paper, the champion of the world. In 1984, at the age of 42, Ali made public what many close to him had feared for years. He had Parkinson's. And with that announcement came a debate that would rage among doctors for decades, a mystery about what really caused it, when it truly began, and whether the sport that made him immortal was also quietly destroying him. This is not simply a boxing story. It is the story of a body and a life breaking down in slow motion, while millions still chanted one word: the greatest. But to understand how the fastest mouth in sports fell silent, we have to go back to a boy in segregated Louisville and a stolen bicycle that changed American history. He was born Cassius Marcellus Clay Jr. on the 17th of January, 1942, in Louisville, Kentucky. His father painted signs and billboards for a living. His mother worked as a domestic helper, cleaning other people's homes. He was a descendant of enslaved people of the antebellum South, carrying African, Irish, and English heritage in his blood, the tangled, painful inheritance of American history itself. Louisville in those years was a segregated city, and segregation was simply the water the boy swam in. His mother, Odessa, later remembered a day when her son was turned away and denied something as small and human as a drink of water at a store, refused simply because of the color of his skin. She said it really affected him. A child, thirsty, told no. That was the world he was being raised to accept. But the moment that pointed him toward destiny came at age 12, and it began with a theft. Young Cassius had a bicycle, and someone stole it. Furious, near tears, the boy went looking for a policeman to report it, and swore he would beat up whoever took it. That policeman happened to be a man named Joe E. Martin, who was also a boxing coach. Martin looked at this fuming child and gave him a piece of advice that would echo through the century. Before you fight anyone, he suggested, you'd better learn how. So the anger of a robbed 12-year-old was redirected into a boxing ring. There was one more hidden vulnerability that few saw. At Central High School, Clay struggled with reading and writing. He was dyslexic, a condition barely understood at the time. The boy who would one day outtalk every microphone in America quietly battled words on a page. But it was not a boxing match that forged his conscience. It was a murder in Mississippi that he said he would never shake off for the rest of his life. In 1955, a 14-year-old black boy named Emmett Till was murdered in Mississippi. The killing shocked the nation and became one of the sparks that lit the civil rights movement. And roughly 200 miles away in Louisville, A 13-year-old Cassius Clay could not let it go. The story reached him, a boy close to his own age, brutalized for existing in a world of deeply rooted injustice. The young Clay did not have the words yet for what he felt, so he channeled the rage the only way a furious child could. Together with a friend, he went and vandalized a local rail yard, a small, defiant act of destruction against a world that had just shown him how little a black child's life could be worth. Years later, he told his daughter Hannah what that moment meant to him. "Nothing would ever shake me up more," he said, "than the story of Emmett Till." This matters because so much of what came later, the defiance, the refusals, the willingness to lose everything for principle, was written off by his critics as showmanship, publicity, a man playing a character for the cameras.
But the fire was there long before the cameras ever found him. It was lit in a 13-year-old boy who understood far too young exactly what kind of country he had been born into. That fire needed discipline, and the gym provided it. Beneath the anger, a machine was being built. An amateur fighter learning speed, timing, and the art of never getting hit. The rage became footwork. The grief became focus. And that inner fire needed a stage, one he'd find at 18 in Rome, where a gold medal would launch a legend and later become one of the most disputed stories he ever told. The rise was staggering.
As an amateur, Clay collected 6 Kentucky Golden Gloves titles, 2 Chicago Golden Gloves, 2 National Golden Gloves championships, 2 Amateur Athletic Union national titles, and victory at the United States Olympic trials. His amateur record stood at 100 wins against just 8 losses. Then came the crown jewel, the light heavyweight gold medal at the 1960 Summer Olympics in Rome. He was 18 years old, and he had conquered the world's best amateurs. And here is where the legend and the history begin to blur. In his 1975 autobiography, Ali told a searing story. He said that shortly after returning from Rome, an Olympic champion for his country, he and a friend were refused service at a whites-only restaurant. Refused. A gold medalist turned away in his own homeland. He said a confrontation with a white gang followed, and that in his anguish and disgust, he took that Olympic gold medal and threw it into the Ohio River. It is a devastating image, a young man's proudest achievement, sinking into dark water because his country would not serve him a meal. But we have to be honest about what we actually know, because this is the version Ali told in his own book, not confirmed history. Several people who knew him well pushed back. His close friend Bundini Brown and the photographer Howard Bingham both disputed that it happened at all. And Thomas Hauser, who wrote a landmark biography of Ali, offered a quieter account, that Ali was indeed refused service at a diner, but that he simply lost the medal about a year after he won it. So which is true? Perhaps the medal sank in protest. Perhaps it was misplaced. Perhaps memory, over the years, reshaped a painful truth into a symbol. What's certain is this. Decades later, at the 1996 Olympics in Atlanta, a trembling Ali would be handed a replacement medal at the very games where he lit the torch before the world. Whether the medal sank or vanished, one thing was certain. The boy from Louisville was about to face a man the whole boxing world believed would destroy him. The professional journey began quietly, almost humbly. On the 29th of October, 1960, a young Cassius Clay stepped into the ring for his first paid fight and walked away with a 6-round decision over a man named Tunney Hunsaker. It was a modest start for a fighter who never spoke modestly about anything. But what followed was anything but modest. From that debut through the end of 1963, Clay ran his record to 19 wins and 0 losses, 15 of those victories coming by knockout. He was young, he was loud, and he was undefeated.
But the boxing establishment still didn't take him seriously as a threat to the crown. That crown belonged to a fearsome man named Sonny Liston. Liston was everything Clay was not: silent, menacing, and devastating. He had crushed the former heavyweight champion Floyd Patterson not once, but twice, both times in the very first round. To most observers, Liston wasn't just a champion, he was a wrecking machine. So when the 22-year-old Clay signed to fight him on the 25th of February 1964, the odds told the story. Clay was an 8-1 underdog.
His recent showings against Doug Jones and Henry Cooper had been uninspired, even shaky, and many in the press believed the brash young man was about to be silenced for good. Some reporters wondered aloud whether he was frightened, whether all that talk was hiding a fighter who knew he was overmatched. Then the bell rang, and the world learned it had been fooled. Clay danced, he stung, he baffled the champion with speed no heavyweight was supposed to possess. And when Liston failed to answer the bell, the impossible had happened. At just 22 years old, Cassius Clay became the youngest boxer ever to take the heavyweight title from a reigning champion. But the shock in the ring was nothing compared to the shock that came next.
Within that same year, the new champion announced that Cassius Clay was a name he no longer wanted, a name, he said, tied to the era of enslavement. He became Muhammad Ali, and a nation that had barely learned to say his old name suddenly didn't know what to do with him at all. If the first Liston fight shocked the world, the rematch confused it, and the confusion has never fully cleared. They met again about a year later, and this time the ending came so fast, so strangely, that people are still arguing about it decades later. Liston went down early, dropped by a right hand from Ali that many spectators swore they never even saw. It became known as the Phantom Punch, and almost immediately, the whispers began.
Many questioned whether Liston's fall was genuine at all. Here we have to be careful, because this is territory where speculation has long outrun proof. Over the years, various theories were floated: that Liston had reasons of his own to go down, that pressures off the ring may have shaped what happened inside it. But these remain theories, not established facts, and it would be unfair to state any of them as certain. What the record does show is this: slow-motion replays reveal that Liston was indeed caught by a short, chopping right hand from Ali. Whether that blow was truly enough to end the fight, no one can say for sure. The punch was real. Its power is what remains in dispute. But something larger than any single punch was reshaping Ali's life. In the early 1960s, he had joined the Nation of Islam, embracing a faith and an identity that put him squarely at odds with much of white America. The reaction from the boxing world was swift and punitive. The World Boxing Association, one of the two major governing bodies, stripped him of his title following his affiliation with the nation. Think about that. A man had won the championship in the ring, fairly and undeniably, and institutions moved to take it from him, not for anything he did as a fighter, but for what he believed and who he chose to be. It was a preview of a much larger collision to come. Ali's faith, his voice, and his growing political conscience were about to smash headlong into the most powerful force of all, the United States government itself. In 1967, Muhammad Ali made a decision that would define him more than any fight ever could. Called to be drafted into the military during the Vietnam War, he refused. He refused on religious grounds and on ethical grounds, declaring that his conscience would not allow it. The punishment was staggering. He was found guilty of draft evasion. He was stripped of his boxing titles.
And after his title defense against Zora Fawley, the state of New York suspended his boxing license, a move quickly echoed elsewhere, effectively locking him out of his own profession across the country. The legal blow came on the 20th of June. He was convicted, sentenced to 5 years, and fined $10,000. He remained free while his lawyers appealed the case, but the damage was already unfolding. For a fighter, time is everything, and Ali was about to lose nearly 4 years. 4 years that fell squarely in the physical prime of his athletic life, the very years when a heavyweight is fastest, strongest, and most dangerous. There was a bitter irony buried in all of this. Back in 1964, the same military that would later demand him had actually reclassified him as Class 1Y, fit for service only in a national emergency. Why? Because he had failed the Armed Forces qualifying test. His writing and spelling skills were judged substandard, a struggle rooted in the dyslexia he had quietly carried since boyhood. In other words, the institution once decided he did not measure up to its standards, and then, when the war deepened, came back and insisted it needed him after all. Ali would not bend. He accepted the cost, the titles, the income, the freedom to do the one thing he did better than any man alive. He traded his prime for his principles. He would eventually win his freedom back in the highest court in the land, but the lost years had already begun quietly stealing something that no courtroom victory and no comeback could ever return. For nearly 4 years, the greatest heavyweight of his generation could not fight, and in that silence, something remarkable happened. The exile made him larger than boxing ever could. In 1971, the Supreme Court of the United States overturned his conviction. The man branded a criminal by his government had been vindicated at the highest level. He was free to return to the ring. But the fighter who came back was not quite the same untouchable phenomenon who had left it. The years away had cost him a step, a fraction of that impossible speed. And yet, in another sense, he returned more powerful than before, not as an athlete, but as a symbol. During his years away from the ring, Ali had become something no champion had ever been. His refusal to be drafted had turned him into an icon of the 1960s counterculture, a rallying point for a generation questioning its country's path. And for Black Americans living through the civil rights movement, he became a towering figure of racial pride, a man who had everything to lose and chose to lose it rather than betray his conscience. His stance on the war was remembered in words that have echoed for decades, that he had no quarrel with the people of Vietnam, and that his true adversaries were those who had long oppressed Black Americans here at home. It should be said honestly that the exact wording so often attributed to him is considered by historians to be, at least in part, apocryphal, polished and reshaped in the retelling. But the sentiment was unmistakable, and it was pure Ali. He aimed his defiance not at strangers overseas, but at the injustice he had known since he was a thirsty child turned away from a store counter. Now, the exile was over. The symbol was ready to become a fighter again. And waiting for him was a series of battles so brutal, so legendary, that they would define not just his career, but but the entire sport. Wars against the fiercest men of his era. They would give him his greatest glory, and some would later wonder whether those same wars quietly began to take their toll on the man himself. The Ali who came back from exile stepped into an era that would produce the most punishing fights of his life, and some of the most legendary in the history of the sport. These were not showcases, they were wars. First came Joe Frazier, a fighter every bit as proud and unyielding as Ali himself. Their first meeting was billed as the fight of the century, and it earned the name. To that point, it was the biggest boxing event the world had ever seen. Two undefeated champions, each with a legitimate claim to the crown, standing toe-to-toe. It was 15 rounds of relentless, grinding punishment. And when it was over, Frazier had won. Ali had tasted defeat for the first time. Then, in 1974, came the moment that seemed almost impossible. George Foreman was younger, bigger, and terrifyingly powerful, a man who had demolished nearly everyone put in front of him. Few gave the aging Ali a real chance. But in the rumble in the jungle, staged half a world away, Ali did the unthinkable. He absorbed round after round against the ropes, letting Foreman punch himself into exhaustion, then struck when the giant had nothing left. He reclaimed the heavyweight championship of the world. From 1974 to 1978, he stood once again as the undisputed champion. And then came the third act with Frazier, the Thrilla in Manila. It may have been the most brutal fight either man ever fought. In the suffocating heat, across 14 savage rounds, the two warriors pushed each other to the very edge of human endurance. Ali won, but he later said it was the closest thing to passing he had ever known. Here is the uncomfortable truth beneath all that glory. Each of these wars was written into history in the same ink as the damage they may have done. The world was cheering, but something was being spent, something that could never be earned back. And in one fight, just a year after Manila, the toll would leave a mark that science could actually measure. In 1977, Muhammad Ali fought a heavy-handed brawler named Ernie Shavers. It went the full 15 rounds, and it was punishing in a way that didn't announce itself in a knockout. Shavers landed 266 punches across that fight, 266 blows absorbed by a man who was already showing his age. And years later, when researchers went back and studied recordings of Ali's voice, they found something chilling. After that single fight, his speech had slowed by 16%. 16% from one night in the ring. It fit into a larger and more haunting pattern. That same body of research determined that the rate at which Ali spoke, his syllables per second, had slowed by 26% between the ages of 26 and 39. He was slurring his words by 1978. That is 3 years before he finally retired, and 6 full years before any doctor would give his condition a name. The tragedy is that people close to him noticed. His own personal physician, Ferdy Pacheco, remarked on the deterioration in Ali's speech as early as 1978. 2 years after that, his father, Cassius Clay Sr., and the promoter Bob Arum voiced their own concerns. His longtime trainer, Angelo Dundee, suspected something was wrong during the last few years Ali was still fighting. Dundee remembered the champion gradually slowing down, and he remembered reporters having to lean in close during later interviews just to make out what Ali was saying. The signs were there. They were audible. The people who loved him and worked beside him could hear the change in the one instrument that had always been unbreakable: his voice. And yet the fights kept coming. When a reporter dared to suggest out loud that Ali was already damaged. The champion answered with a line that now reads less like defiance and more like a man refusing to hear what his own body was telling him. It was 1981, and Muhammad Ali was near the end. Before what would be his final fight, a columnist from the New York Times pressed him on the whispers that had been trailing him for years, the talk that the great voice was failing, that something was wrong inside. Ali's response has echoed ever since. "They say I have brain damage, can't talk no more," he said. "How do I sound now?" At the time, it may have sounded like classic Ali, quick, sharp, turning a hard question back on the questioner. But listen to it today, knowing everything that came after, and it lands very differently. It sounds like denial, spoken in real time. A man daring the world to believe his ears, even as those ears were already telling a different story. The biographer, Jonathan Eig, who spent years studying Ali's life, reached a sobering conclusion. He believed that Ali knew he was doing damage to himself, and that he kept boxing too long anyway. That is perhaps the quietest tragedy of all. Not a fighter blindsided by fate, but a fighter who sensed the cost and could not bring himself to walk away from the only arena where he had ever felt fully alive. He did finally retire in 1981, turning toward religion, philanthropy, and activism. His spiritual life had already been deepening for years. In the mid-1970s, following the passing of the Nation of Islam's longtime leader, Elijah Muhammad, Ali had moved towards Sunni Islam, a shift that would define the more reflective, peaceful figure the world came to know in his later decades. But retirement could not undo what had been done. 3 years after he stepped away from the ring, in a hospital in New York, a neurologist would finally put a name to the thing. His father, his doctor, and his own slowing words had been trying to tell everyone for years. It was September of 1984. Ali was 3 years into retirement, and something was clearly wrong. There were tremors. His movements had grown slow, his speech was slurred, and he was gripped by an unexplained fatigue that no amount of rest seemed to cure. He traveled to New York, and for a week he was evaluated at Columbia Presbyterian Medical Center by a neurologist named Dr. Stanley Fawn. At the end of that week, Fawn delivered the news. Muhammad Ali had Parkinson's disease. He was 42 years old. Young onset, the doctors called it, a diagnosis that arrives earlier in life than most. And with that diagnosis came a debate that would not be settled for decades. Here we have to tread carefully, because this is a question that genuinely divided serious doctors. Some reports pointed straight at boxing, at all those punches, all those wars, the 266 blows in a single night. It seemed obvious to many. But Ali himself and his specialist physicians disputed any simple cause. Head trauma is a known risk factor for developing Parkinson's later in life. That much is accepted. But a known risk factor is not the same thing as a confirmed cause. Years later, the physicians who treated Ali at Emory University laid out the clearest picture available. They described his case as a 34-year chronic progressive presentation, marked by an asymmetric resting tremor that responded to the standard medication. Features they said pointed to classic Parkinson's disease. And on the question everyone wanted answered, they were unflinchingly honest. A causative association in the Ali case, they wrote, cannot be determined. That is the truthful bottom line. Boxing may have played a role. It may have helped trigger what came.
But the disease he lived with for the rest of his life was Parkinson's, not the trauma-driven condition so often assumed. The certainty people crave simply does not exist. What did exist from that day forward was a long, slow fight, the longest of his life. And it would raise painful questions, not only about his health, but about the people who surrounded him as the champion grew more vulnerable with each passing year. Behind the roar of the crowds and the glow of the championship belts, there was a private life, and it was as turbulent as any of his fights. Muhammad Ali married 4 times. His first marriage, to Sanjay Roy, began in 1964 and ended just 2 years later. His second, to Belinda Boyd, lasted from 1967 to 1976, through the exile, the return, and the greatest wars of his career. His third marriage, to Veronica Porsche, ran from 1977 until 1986. And finally came Yolanda, known to everyone as Lonnie, whom he married in 1986 and who remained at his side through the long years of his illness. In all, he fathered 9 children, among them his daughter Layla, who would one day step into a boxing ring herself. It would be easy to reduce all of this to headlines, but the fuller truth is quieter and sadder. This was a man who lived every part of his life at maximum intensity, in the ring, in his faith, in his politics, and in his heart. That intensity brought him glory. It also brought upheaval, broken marriages, and children raised across a scattered and complicated family. The cost of a life lived that loudly is rarely paid by one person alone. And then there is the harder question, the one that has followed Ali's story for decades, and the one that must be handled with real care. As Parkinson's tightened its grip, and the once untouchable champion grew more dependent on those around him, some biographers and family members raised questions over the years about who truly controlled access to him during his later life. Who spoke for a man whose own voice was fading? Who made decisions for a legend who could no longer make them as easily himself? These are questions, not verdicts. No confirmed record from the sources available names specific individuals as wrongdoers, and no documented case of financial exploitation can be stated here as fact. This remains a contested and murky part of the story, whispered more than proven. What is undeniable is the human core beneath it. Fame had turned Ali into a resource, a name, a face, a fortune that many people had reason to want near. And illness had turned that same untouchable figure into someone increasingly vulnerable. The man who had once towered over everyone now needed help to stand. That vulnerability, more than any single accusation, is the true heart of this chapter. Even so, as his body betrayed him and his private world drew scrutiny, one impossible night in 1996 would remind the entire planet that the fire inside him had never gone out. The stadium fell into hushed anticipation. It was the summer of 1996, the opening ceremony of the Olympic Games in Atlanta, and the identity of the final torchbearer had been kept a closely guarded secret. Then a figure stepped from the shadows, and a gasp rolled across the crowd. It was him. Muhammad Ali stood before the world, holding the Olympic flame. But this was not the lightning-fast young man who had danced past Sonny Liston. His left hand trembled visibly, shaken by the Parkinson's that had been advancing for more than a decade. For a long, breathless moment, he struggled to steady himself, the fire flickering in his unsteady grip. And then, with enormous effort and unmistakable resolve, he touched the flame to the wick and set the games alight.
Millions watching around the globe wept. It was one of the most powerful images in the history of sport, not because of strength, but because of its absence and the courage that filled the space where strength had been. This was a man laying his fragility bare before a watching planet and refusing to be diminished by it. And there was a second, quieter act of redemption folded into those same games. At the Georgia Dome, Ali was presented with a replacement Olympic gold medal, a new one to stand in for the light heavyweight gold he had won in Rome so long ago. Remember the story he once told of a medal thrown into the dark waters of the Ohio River after his own country refused to serve him a meal? Whether that medal truly sank in protest or was simply lost to time, no one can say for certain. But here, 36 years later, that painful chapter came full circle. The trembling hands that had struggled with the torch now held a golden medal once more. There was something else remarkable in that ovation. This was a nation that had once turned on him, that had stripped his titles, suspended his license, and branded him a criminal for refusing to fight in a war he did not believe in. Now, that same nation rose to its feet to honor him as a symbol of courage, conscience, and endurance. The man they had once tried to silence had become, in his silence, more beloved than ever. But behind the applause, the disease was tightening its hold, and the final chapter would test the family that remained at his side. He lived with Parkinson's for 32 years. Read that number again and let it settle. The man who had once filled arenas with his voice, who had rhymed and taunted and predicted and declared himself the greatest of all time, would spend more than 3 decades slowly losing the very things that had made him a phenomenon. His speech grew harder and harder to understand. His movements slowed until even the simplest gestures became labor. As the years passed, he made fewer and fewer public appearances, retreating from the spotlight that had once seemed to follow him everywhere. And through it all, he was cared for by his family, the people closest to him, tending to a legend as the world's greatest fighter waged his longest and most private battle. There is a strange and moving dignity in that final chapter. The young Ali had communicated through words, a torrent of them, quick and dazzling and impossible to silence. The elder Ali communicated through presence, a look, a gesture, the simple fact of showing up. He had lost the instrument that made him famous, and yet somehow his meaning only grew. This is the deepest truth of the tragedy at the center of his story. A man betrayed by his own body, robbed piece by piece of his gifts, and still, undeniably, himself. On the 3rd of June, 2016, in Scottsdale, Arizona, Muhammad Ali passed away. He was 74 years old. The long fight was over. And here the story leaves us with one last haunting silence. Before his passing, Ali had made his wishes clear. He declined an autopsy. That decision meant there would be no post-mortem examination of his tissue, no final laboratory verdict on the question that had followed him for decades. Did the punishment of the ring cause the disease that claimed him, or did it arrive on its own? Without that final examination, the debate can never be fully closed. The greatest fighter of his age left the world exactly as he had lived in it, leaving us to wonder, to argue, and to marvel. He departed without a final medical answer, but he left behind something no diagnosis could ever measure. What does a man like Muhammad Ali leave behind when the fights are finished and the voice has fallen quiet. The honors alone could fill a room. In 1999, Sports Illustrated named him Sportsman of the Century, and the BBC named him Sports Personality of the Century. An athlete crowned not just the best of a season or a decade, but of an entire 100 years. He remains to this day widely regarded as the greatest heavyweight boxer of all time, a global cultural icon known simply as the greatest. He now rests in Cave Hill Cemetery in his hometown of Louisville, Kentucky, the city where a furious 12-year-old once went looking for a stolen bicycle and found a destiny instead. But to measure Ali only in titles and trophies is to miss the point of him entirely. He was more than a fighter. He was a spoken-word artist whose 2 studio albums both earned Grammy nominations. He was a pioneer of a rhythmic, rhyming style of talk that would echo through generations of music yet to come. He was a man who turned trash talk into poetry and made the microphone as much his arena as the ring. And above all, he was a conscience. He stood at the crossroads of the most turbulent decades in modern American life, through segregation, through the civil rights movement, through the anguish of Vietnam, and he refused to shrink. He gave up his titles, his prime, and nearly his freedom, rather than betray what he believed. He became a symbol of racial pride and moral courage, precisely because he was willing to pay for his convictions in the currency that mattered most to him, his career. That is the paradox at the heart of his story. His body was ultimately taken from him, worn down and stilled by an illness that stole his speed, his strength, and his glorious voice. In that sense, the greatest athlete of his time was betrayed by the very instrument that made him immortal. And yet, in the long silence of his final decades, something in him only grew larger, a stubborn, radiant dignity that no tremor could touch. He lost his voice. He never lost his meaning. Muhammad Ali showed the world what an athlete could be, not merely a champion, but a man of conscience, a symbol, a force that reshaped the very idea of greatness. And that, in the end, is what he truly won.